welcome. Today we have Ellen Schell, the legal director of the Legal Project of the Capital District, and Jackie Williams, who's the director of policy and education for NSCASA. And NSCASA is New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Hi, how are you two doing?
Hi. Very well. Thanks for having us
Good.
here.
I want to continue on the topic of statute of limitations because there's another real area that we didn't discuss is offenders. If the offender is a minor, how does that affect the statute of limitations?
Well, that's a really important question that very often people call and say something happened and I wonder why the person who got arrested isn't getting a life sentence or isn't getting a stronger sentence. And when I ask the question, well, how old were they? Well, 16, 17, 15, 14. And that surprises some people because the age of offending does start very early. The good news is that people are actually disclosing and making reports so that these 14, 15, 16-year-olds are being held accountable. However, they are being held accountable to a somewhat different standard because of their age. And New York does have different categories of youthful offenders that allows them perhaps more time for rehabilitation. For example, an offender below the age of 21 is required to get rehabilitation services, education, and counseling that is not necessarily required of those 21 and over, under the belief that perhaps they can learn and change their ways. So that is important, and if someone has a situation where the offender was a minor, they do need to be aware of that.
Okay. Oh, wow. So the charge against them, or not the charge against them, but actually what the punishment's going to be.
The sentence can vary based upon the defendant's age. And if you look at the penal code, it actually does have a number of provisions, whether the defendant is below 18, 18, or 21. And the sentence is commensurate with the defendant's age, as well as the victim's age. But that's one of the things that we do get calls at NSCASA about, wondering, well, why did this 17-year-old get X as opposed to Y? Or I heard this 35-year-old got a certain sentence, but not a 13-year-old. And it is important also to note that in the most heinous crimes, and I hate that word, but New York does allow for a minor as young as 12 or 13 to be treated as an adult in violent crimes. And certain levels of rape in the first degree are a violent crime, and they could in fact be sentenced to a maximum as an adult.
Oh, even at 12 years old?
Yes.
Okay. And Ellen, does the Legal Project take calls from someone who may just was sexually assaulted? Would the Legal Project get a lot of calls like that?
We don't tend to get calls from people who have immediately just experienced the assault. And if we would, the first thing I would always do is refer them to their local rape crisis program, because we're not really set up to do crisis intervention and the kinds of things that rape crisis centers are definitely set up to do. We do have a program to provide civil legal assistance for sexual assault survivors, and people access that by calling our number, and they usually end up getting me on the telephone. And I try to find out what it is they're looking for, because a lot of times there are legal issues that someone might have as the result of a sexual assault that aren't things that can be done in the criminal justice system. Mostly what we think of when we think of sexual assault, we think of prosecuting the assailant. But in fact, sometimes someone might need to change the shift that they're working because they were assaulted and they work a night shift and they can't do that anymore. Or they might be having a problem with their landlord because they were assaulted and they need to move to another apartment because they can't stand to stay in the apartment. Or, you know, there's all kinds of things that legal intervention can help them with, and we try to provide that.
So you'd help them with that, like if they needed to have some locks put on the apartment, or have difficulty changing their schedule with their employer.
We would try to negotiate with a landlord or an employer in that situation. Sometimes there's actually legal action that we could take in court to help in a situation like that. We're not, unfortunately, allowed to actually sue a rapist or sue a third party. It would be nice if we could, but our grants prohibit us from doing that. But we can make referrals to attorneys who can do that if the person is wanting that kind of action. We do get a lot of calls from people with these very questions that we've been talking about tonight. I was assaulted as a child. What, you know, what are my options now? And unfortunately, most of the time what I end up doing is saying, you know, your options are really limited. There probably aren't any real legal options that I can offer you. And then I'll talk with people about, you know, what other ways might you be able to accomplish some of the things you want. Is what you want to confront the assailant about what happened? Is what you want is for other people to know what happened? What is it? And to try to do a little problem solving in that way. And I recently was in a meeting with Jackie, which just shows you that anybody can learn new things at any moment. And she was talking about situations like that and how the Crime Victims Board can be an assistance to people in that situation, which I was unaware of. So now I have a whole other range of things that I can tell clients. But I'm going to let Jackie talk about that.
Okay.
This is, again, going back to the services that are already in existence that people don't know about. And we have a brochure here from the crime, it says Crime Victims Can Get Help, and it's from the Crime Victims Board of the State of New York. And what this is it is a service for people who have been a victim of a crime, and that could be a carjacking, a murder, a break-in, a domestic violence situation, a sexual assault. For most people, they have to apply for that within 1 year of the crime. Because of the nature of domestic violence and sexual assault, where people generally report much later, and the after effects of the crime can be, unfortunately, over a lifetime, and especially when it deals with substance abuse, some mental health services, counseling. The time limit right now goes back to the time where the board was established, which was in the late 60s. So for example, that adult who calls up saying, I was assaulted as a child, what can I do? Criminally, I would say the statute of limitation has run out. Civilly, Ellen would say the statute of limitation has run out. In terms of services, though, we can offer them an application to the Crime Victims Board to say, have you received counseling? Have you had any inpatient services? Have you had costs as a victim of a crime that were not covered by insurance and other means? And if so, you can apply for reimbursement or assistance. And for some families, just the thought that they could get some help. And for most of us, our homeowners or our apartment insurance deductible is higher than the cost of changing a lock or getting a new door. The Crime Victims Board is set up for that. You were the innocent victim of a crime. No one asked you to have your locks broken. This money is not taxpayer money. That's very important to note. It comes from people who have committed crimes. There is a crime victim fee that they have to pay, and it's just gone up from $10 to $20 as of November 1st. That money goes into a fund, and so therefore when a crime is committed, you can apply to the fund and say, I need X amount of services, or I had X amount of doctor's bills that my insurance didn't cover or that Medicaid won't pick up, and you have the opportunity of getting some of that paid back. And generally for an adult survivor, it's for counseling.
That's what I understand is more people collect the money for therapy, medical expenses. I know when we do talk about other crimes, if someone, personal property, like if they had a robbery in their home or their car in person, that crime victim, you may be eligible to receive the money back from the personal property that was stolen. I think the therapy, I mean, that just really adds up. And it'll cover co-pays too, right, if they
Again,
do have
anything
insurance.
that your insurance does not cover, you can apply for the difference. So if you're fortunate enough to have insurance, but unfortunate to have a limited number of visits you can make, so if your therapist says, well, after 5 visits I have to charge you 100%, then you can submit that to the Crime Victims Board, and they can consider that for some reimbursement. So it's still, it's something. And for a lot of people who say they want the offender to pay, sometimes the payment is in the way of restoring them, and the restoration is getting some counseling. So although the criminal system or the civil system can't bring that person to court, that person may still get some services through this. And we strongly encourage people to fill it out. And it's an application like anything else, and it's up to the investigators in the process to determine. But the more people know that services are out there, they don't have to suffer, and if finances are one reason they're not going forward, this might be something that can help them.
And they're at 112 State Street in Albany, correct?
No,
The
they're
Crime
actually
Victims
on
Office?
Central Avenue.
Oh, do you know their address?
It's
Oh, here
845
it is.
Central.
Oh, okay. Let's
And
find
again,
that.
any rape crisis program, hospitals have that available, law enforcement offices. Your local victim service program, even if they're not sexual assault, in many counties they're called the Crime Victim Assistance Program. If you were to call and ask for an application, the application is free. There are people to help you fill it out if you have questions about what paperwork is required. But again, it's there.
Okay, 845 Central Avenue. Where is that? Is that by Westgate?
It's near Westgate Plaza.
Near Westgate. And then you're around the corner from there on 63 Colvin Avenue.
Yes, we are, right
which
off
is
Central.
perpendicular to Central. And the Legal Project, would you give that address again?
We're at 6 Executive Park Drive, and that's behind Stuyvesant Plaza, out just off of Western Avenue.
One thing I was wondering when I was asking you about the phone calls that you got, that the agency received, wasn't pertaining to the minors. Have you found that there are more minors that are offenders or being charged as offenders than adults?
I wouldn't say that there are more. I think there are more being charged now than there were several years ago, because in some respects, getting the word out about what sexual assault is causing more people to say, hey, wait a minute, this isn't right, this isn't supposed to happen, or I'm going to tell someone. And that's a good thing. When you look at national statistics of crimes going down, overall, sexual assault reports have gone up. And it's not that we think that there are more reports, but that more people are reporting, and hopefully they're reporting when they've been offended fewer times. And if that happens when they're young, when they're an adolescent, the first time they're in college, then perhaps it won't continue.
Okay.
I think what's really important to remember is that, 25, 30 years ago, we weren't talking about this stuff at all. There were no such thing as rape crisis centers, and people just did not talk about it. And we have, in a really short sort of historical period, created an environment where people can at least hear about these things on TV shows like this, see it on, network television in whatever dramas or sitcoms it might show up in, and we've created a dialogue about it in a way that just didn't exist before. So people are, I think, more aware that there are places that they can come to get assistance, and I think that there is a lot more talk about it. But it's also pretty clear that the crime itself, the problem of sexual assault, is not really diminishing, unfortunately.
Do you know about different countries? Are we higher in sexual assault cases than other countries?
The United States is still the highest. The United States is still the most violent country, regardless of what you hear on national news in terms of interpersonal violence. We are number one, and
Number
that's not
one
something to be proud of.
In the world of violent crimes.
For interpersonal violence, yes.
Wow. Wow.
And one of the other, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, but we've also, there are people who are working to try to change that, to try to serve those victims of crime, and doing things like working, like NISCASA has for so many years, on changing the laws to make them more responsive to victims of crime. And the Crime Victims Board didn't exist until the late 60s. Rape crisis centers didn't exist until then. We've changed the laws in a number of ways, not to in any way imply that we have completed our work, because it's an ongoing project, but we certainly have made some progress and tried to respond to that great need out there.
What do you feel can be done with offenders before they offend? What do we need to do to change this?
Well, that's a societal attitude problem, and some of it going legislatively. There have been several bills over the last 2 years called Dignity for All Students, and they're regarding sexual harassment and bullying. Some schools call it citizenship and comportmentship, but the idea of how do you establish a healthy relationship very early on, and that's in all aspects, not just sexually. In New York State, K through 6 are supposed to have sexual violence awareness and body knowledge. It's very scattered. It's not done uniformly. So if we had people learning how to behave kinder toward each other, how to approach another person that they like, and once they want to begin having intimate relations, how to do it in a positive manner, I do firmly believe that the rate of sexual violence will go down. If we keep talking about what to do with the offenders after the fact, it still isn't going to solve it. There are some very good offender programs out there, and we do work collaboratively with offender programs. A lot of people don't realize that if you're working to advocate for victims, you also have to advocate for offenders, many of which, unfortunately, some are victim offenders and some are offending victims. So you sometimes do cross the line.
Now,
And
what do you mean by that? That they were a victim and now they're an offender? Is that what a victim offender is?
yes, some
Okay.
have been, although not most.
Okay.
Not
And what's
most.
an offender victim?
An offender victim, again, it depends upon what the person did the last time, if that makes any sense. If a person offends and they're also being perpetrated against, in the case of, say, siblings, and this goes back to some of the minor offenders, there are sibling abuse, which we don't hear about an awful lot, but does exist. If you have siblings that are offending one another, they may also be getting offended upon by the parent or another family member.
Okay.
So if it's a matter of who has the power against whom, so in that case they are offender victim, victor offenders, and they do deserve treatment and care as a victim. They also need to be stopped from offending their younger siblings.
Now, who made the determination for the words that are used in the legal process? Offender, and I want to bring up about sodomy because that just changed. So where did all these legal words come from?
Well, when the legislators write the law, they decide how they want to describe something, and it's usually in great detail and in words that none of us in the real world would use to describe whatever it is. So it's always important when you read a law to understand that the word that you think you know the meaning of might not be the meaning, might not have the meaning that you think it has.
Now, if we just take the word offender, all right, is there a written definition that's the legal definition of the word offender?
There probably is
Okay.
in some context.
Otherwise, it's by usage of the words in the bill as it's passed in a law, then makes it become the legal word for that situation.
If the
or
bill
that.
becomes law with
Okay.
that word in it, if that word is assailant or perpetrator or offender or anything else, once a bill becomes law, that's the legal word.
Because the word offender just knocks me over. I mean, to me, an offender is like you offended me by disrespecting my hair or something, you know, you didn't like my sweater.
Well,
you
it's
know, you
really-
offended me. And I just, to me, it does not have the impact, it doesn't even come close to the impact of what an offender is.
Well, really, because these are criminal offenses against
Okay.
the state, so that's where that offender word comes from. It's somebody who commits a criminal offense.
Right.
We use a lot of terms as sort of shorthand for things. You know, sometimes we'd say assailant, sometimes offenders.
Okay.
One thing I do want to point out, if we've got a minute, is that survivor is a term that we in the movement against sexual violence have really chosen to use because people, we don't want to focus on the fact that they've become a victim as the result of this, that we want to focus on what they've done to survive the assault, to survive and get through to the point where they are not over it, because that doesn't happen, but where they have created a life for themselves that integrates that event and has moved on to the extent that they have survived it. That's what we want to focus on.
I heard another word too that goes along with that, or that it was victim, survivor, thriver. Or is
people
that the
have-
wrong?
No, some people have used it. There are a number of terms out there, but the most common ones are the when to use victim and when to use survivor. And most times we talk about survivors within the law. We do talk very often about victimization because the law states
The law
defendant
uses the word victim,
Right.
correct?
And when someone comes to a hospital, they are a victim at that moment in time. They become a patient of the hospital. When they walk out, they're a survivor. As they're going through the various processes, it depends on what stage they're in. But typically, yes, we do use the word survivor as opposed to victim.
Victim, I think, connotates such a negative term. You know, it just makes the person so, I don't know, downtrodden, empathetic, when they can be a very strong, healthy, you know, everyday person, and
person
they've been
becomes-
victimized.
Right, the person becomes victimized.
Yes, they become
They are
victimized.
not a victim,
Yeah.
they were victimized.
Correct.
And that way the onus is put on the offender perpetrator.
Correct.
And one of the things we need to do is work on our language. You don't talk about, sexual assault as being a women's
A lot of people
issue.
consider it a women's issue, and it's so not.
And it's not.
Yeah.
So it's how we use language that we, in fact, sometimes harm ourselves in the movement. And the language of victimization, all of us at some point in our lives have been victimized by something, somehow, somewhere. But that's not the thing that we use to define ourselves. So if you were a victim of sexual assault, why should that be your defining feature? You're also a student, a mother, a lawyer, a program person, a daughter, whatever. But you don't get up in the morning and say, I'm a victim.
Well, besides that, I think victim focuses on what happened to you, and survivor focuses on what you did to get through it.
That's a good way to look at it, too. Now, what about the word sodomy? I understand that it's been omitted now from the law, as per Jackie's information. What's that about?
Well, the sexual assault laws really have had a history in very far back law using very old-fashioned terms, and we worked quite hard several years ago to make a comprehensive change in those laws, and needed to be cleaned up still this past year. But one of those things was to take out some of those offensive terms like deviant sexual intercourse, sodomy, and some of the things that have such negative old-fashioned connotations, and to make it more modern, I guess, is in a way to make it less loaded, emotionally loaded for those terms.
The pejorative words of sodomy, people's minds go to all kinds of places. The penal code is strictly about what activity took place between what persons. None of the other acts have any type of an adjective in front of the word intercourse. So under oral or anal, the need to have the word deviant, well, what is deviant intercourse? We're talking about a crime. And what we're talking about the words, New York State also made the various crimes of sexual assault gender neutral a few years ago. Whereas the definitions before that were very clear about what took place to a woman or to a wife, to a person not married to the partner. It was extremely judgmental. And so we did some things to change that, and by removing the words deviant sexual intercourse and changing the crime of sodomy to criminal sexual act, it just goes along with that, treating everyone the same under the eyes of the law.
Really? So in place of the word sodomy, what's
criminal sexual act?
Criminal sexual act. Well, then that could include any type of penetration, right?
The definition of rape and criminal sexual act is exactly the same. It's penetration, however slight. Some of the things that we do when we advocate for legislative change is compromise. So even though we might have wished certain language to be used, then various members of the Assembly or the Senate or the Governor's office might want other things. Ideally, penetration, however slight, no matter what orifice it is the same, and the penalties are the same. But the language of the law has two different crimes. So we have rape, which can apply to a male or a female, and we have criminal sexual act, which is also gender neutral. It can apply to a male or a female. It's up to the district attorney to determine which one to charge.
Oh, so the way it was before, when it was sodomy, it was against a male?
No, it didn't have to be.
Oh, no, it didn't.
The act, it was the description of the act that we wanted changed.
Okay.
Because there is no such thing as deviant sexual intercourse. There is intercourse, and there is not intercourse. And by taking that out, it removes all the judgmental. The description of the act is exactly the same.
And once again, what is it now?
It's criminal sexual act.
Okay.
And that will be for first degree. And that's
felony.
forcible compulsion. It's the same as first degree rape.
Okay.
And that means
it's just a matter of words.
Right. But it describes also how the act was accomplished, by force.
By force.
And what the act was. And also who the assailant and the victim were, ages. It has to be, well, it can be anybody for first degree, but for some of them it has to be an assailant who's over a certain age and a victim who's under a certain age.
Yeah, would you touch on that, Ellen, about the degrees? Now, are these all felonies or some misdemeanors, sexual assault?
There's a whole range from A misdemeanors up through B felonies, B violent felonies.
Be violent.
And those are all terms of art defined in the statute, what that means.
Okay.
But basically, a misdemeanor can't be punished by anything more than 1 year in the county jail. Felonies are a year or more, and that would be in the state prison system for the punishment. Now, there may be probation terms and things like that, but there is a very wide range, and it depends. Generally, the younger the age of the victim, the higher the degree of crime. The more force that's used, the higher the degree of crime, and that kind of thing.
So what is the highest degree of the crime as it pertains to sexual assault
It
crime?
would be first-degree rape or first-degree criminal sexual
Which is a
act.
B felony, which
Okay.
is punishable to
B
up to
felony.
25 years.
Up to 25
Up to 25.
years. And that's the absolute maximum
It depends
charge
on what else occurs. And again,
Okay.
if a rape occurred as part of a murder, yes, you're talking about life. So it could be an element of another crime.
If there was a gun used, it might be there might be some other charges that
have
would
the
go along
weapons
with it.
charge
Right.
to add on. So if it's burglary, add that to it.
Generally, as a rule in New York, if you commit several criminal acts within the same criminal act, like you broke into a house to commit a rape,
Okay.
those are going to be charged. You're going to serve what's called a concurrent sentence with those.
Oh.
You might get
They can't
two
stack 'em
25-year
up.
sentences, but they're not going to add them together.
No. Yeah, one of the things that was added, and how are we doing on time?
2 minutes.
For again, a new crime, the persistent sexual assault was raised. So if you do several misdemeanors, a few smaller crimes, and it used to be you could keep doing the smaller crimes and keep getting a smaller sentence. Now the small ones can be added up. If you do it more than twice, it's now a felony. So
Oh.
it does raise the penalty.
Okay. Yeah, now if you had these different charges that you had in the penal code, can they be stacked up together? If they had different types of sexual assault all at one?
Again, they're usually concurrent, and
Attack.
it's usually the highest one.
Oh.
But again, it all depends. It depends on the case.
And I'd say the Legal Project at 63 Colvin and Niscasa, or excuse me, Niscasa at 63 Colvin and the Legal Project, I keep forgetting the address, I know it's Executive Park.
6 Executive Park.
6
Drive.
Executive Park are great resources for all of you to find out more about the statute of limitations and also find out about each of these agencies and how they might be able to help you. So thank you, each of you, for sharing some information with our audience.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
And take care.